Welcome, everyone. I'm Kara Griffith, the President and CEO of Tax Analysts. Thank you so much for joining us today to discuss one small slice of the topic that everyone is talking about right now, the implications of our presidential and congressional elections. For our purposes today, we keep the conversation targeted in our sweet spot and address the implications of tax policy. We'll discuss the potential scenarios for tax law changes given the coming Republican trifecta that is Republican control of both the White House and the House of Congress. That today's event is another in Tax Analyst series of public discussions taxing issues. We are delighted to be meeting both in person and online today, and we hope to engage with as many of you as possible in our time together. For our final discussion, I will begin by asking a few questions, and we'll leave plenty of time for audience questions. For our in-person audience, please just raise your hand, and someone will come to you with a microphone. For those who are joining online, please use the chat feature to submit questions during today's event. I will do my very best to give equal attention to both those in the room and those who are joining us virtually. You can still receive CPE credit from today's event. To do so, you need to register with Pigeonhole, our interactive Q&A system, by providing your name and email address. If you're interested, just use your mobile device. There's information on Wi-Fi on the 10 cards on every table. If you're online, you just through whatever device you so desire. But either way, please be sure to participate in the program for at least 50 minutes and answer at least 3 of the polling questions. Those polling questions will appear throughout the webinar. For those in the room, just keep Pigeonhole open on your phone, and for those online, Pigeonhole will appear on the right side in the viewing window above the comment section. As a reminder, you need to remain in the default viewing window because you won't be able to see the questions if you expand the program to full screen. The course materials, which are sent out in advance, are also available for download under the viewing window. And now, on to today's topic, the election and its implications for tax policy. As all of you undoubtedly know, 2025 was always going to be a big year for tax policy, no matter who controlled the White House and Congress. That's because at the end of 2025, major provisions 2017 tax cuts and jobs are due to expire. Now, if they do expire, a number of things will happen. The top individual income tax rate will turn to 39.6%, and the tax rates for many average taxpayers will also rise. Withholding will revert to pre-2017 levels. Both the standard deduction and the child tax credit will shrink by 3. The 20% deduction for past due income, known as 199 Cap A, will end. The estate tax exclusion will fall by more than half. A $10,000 SALT deduction cap will disappear, and the AMT will return for many middle-income taxpayers. Now, before the election, Republicans were already talking about extending the TCJA, adjusting GILTI and some other provisions, and possibly scaling back or ending the clean energy incentives from the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act. But that's not all. During the campaign, President-elect Trump proposed other tax and tax-related measures. He talked about cutting the corporate tax rate even further for companies that produce goods domestically, ending the double taxation on Americans who live abroad, eliminating SALT cap altogether, letting individuals deduct interest on car loans, eliminating income tax and Social Security benefits, ending taxes on tips and overtime pay, and imposing huge tariffs on imported goods. Now, even with Republicans controlling all of the levers of power in Washington, the fate of some TCJA provisions and some separate proposals by Trump and other lawmakers could ignite fierce political battles. What to do about this SALT deduction could certainly be one of them, and whether to end the green tax credits from the IRA, certainly another. Now, as the White House and Congress are deciding what to do and how much to do, cost is going to play a central role. Ending the TCJA would cost about $5 trillion over 10 years. And when you add in the tax cuts that President Trump has proposed, the total cost could rise to as much as $9 trillion or even more, depending on who's doing the estimating. This comes at a time when many Republican lawmakers have been railing about the ever rising national debt. Now, whatever they decide to do, no one should be surprised that Republicans will likely use reconciliation to pass a budget. Under reconciliation, a majority can pass legislation with just 51 votes rather than the 60 that's usually needed to pass about just about everything else in the Senate these days. It's an increasingly common way that majority parties in Washington have pushed through major pieces of their budget-related agendas in recent decades. And the last note that I will make is the implications of this month's elections could extend well beyond tax policy and into tax administration. In the appropriations process, both for the current fiscal year and beyond, Republicans could well take aim at the IRS budget, revising some of their recent funding gains. So we have a lot to talk about today, and we will try to hit as many of the topics as we possibly can. So let me introduce the panel briefly. Their bios are available online if anyone wants to go, and then we're going to kick it off a great discussion. So right immediately to my left, we have Caroline Harris. She's a partner with Capital Tax Partners. And we have Monisha Santa Maria. She's a principal in the National Tax Office of KPMG. Chris Towner, policy director with the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. And on the very end, we have Marty Sullivan, chief economist and contributing editor with Tax Notes. So Marty, I'm going to turn to you first down there on the end to kick off our conversation. I'm hoping you can do a little bit of table setting for us today and sort of talk about where we are fiscally, how that might impact legislation in the coming year, and then also walk us through what do we expect in terms of legislation and the process, specifically going through reconciliation.
Thank you, Kara. Okay, when I started to think about this, I said, what are the two most important questions? One is, how much is the deficit going to matter? And how much is reconciliation going to matter? And I think the answer to both of them, and you can't leave yet, but I think the answer to both of them is yes, they're both going to matter a lot. And let me just give you a little numerical background to show that. Hope you folks over there can see. Way back in 2005, by the way, the vertical axis is trillions of dollars. Yeah. Luckily, my editor changed it from billions to trillions because for some reason I thought it was billions. Trillions of dollars is on the vertical axis and time is on the horizontal axis, just 3 decades. So way back in 2005, our federal debt was $4.6 trillion. That was scary. Then we had the financial crisis of 2007, 2009, and it almost tripled to 13.1 trillion. That was really scary. Then here we are in the present, 2025. We had COVID, and it more than doubled to 30.2 trillion. Now that's really, really, really scary. But if things keep going the way they're going in the current, keep pressing the wrong button. If things keep going the way under the current law baseline, our net debt 10 years from now will only about double from what it is now to $53.7 trillion. So deficits are getting a little bit, and the debt is getting a little bit larger. What are we talking about today? Well, we're using the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget's numbers as sort of the scapegoat, or the straw man for all of Trump's policies. Now, are these estimates exact? Or is there any uncertainty about them? No. But if Trump got everything that he wanted during the campaign, we would add $7.5 trillion to the deficit. So I would say deficits are a big deal. Okay, you're entitled to your own opinion. Now, next slide. Let's talk about reconciliation. Way back in the olden days when I was a youngster, they used to pass budgets like this. They went to stage one. They said, let's cut taxes. And they said, let's have some offsetting tax increases. And what was ever left over, that was the deficit. Done. Easy. No problem. Well, that wasn't working out too well as the deficit grew and grew and grew and grew. And now we have budget reconciliation. And we must have budget reconciliation in this Congress because you need 60 votes to pass something in the Senate unless you do it under budget reconciliation. So, what's our process now? Well, instead of going from left to right, we're going to go from right to left. We're going to set a number in the budget reconciliation process. In 2017, we set that number at 1.5 trillion. Back then, that seemed like a lot of money. This time, I would argue it might be 2, it might be 4, it might be 6, 7.5. No, it could be more. But whatever the budget writing committees put in this box will determine what goes into the tax boxes. So you can't do any tax policy until you figure out the budget policy. Now, last time around in 2017, they started in June and they went to September trying to figure this out. A lot of yelling and screaming and pain and horror and everything went into that. And then the actual tax writing process started on November 2nd when Chairman Brady introduced his bill and ended 50 days later when President Trump signed it. Does that mean that's what's going to happen this time? Well, who knows? But let's just take a quick look at what's in this box and what's in this box so you could get some ideas what you might do if. So what if I said, what if the budget committees come out and say 4 trillion? Well, you're going to have to do some cutting over here and some increasing over here. And what if they say 8 trillion? Well, and then you can do whatever you want, pretty much. So let's look at the boxes very quickly. Okay, so here's all the stuff that Mr. Trump wants. Well, the big thing, of course, is extension of the TCJA. $5 trillion, more or less. And since he wants to get rid of the SALT limitation, it was $4 trillion before, but now that he wants to get rid of the SALT limitation, when he visited New York, it's about $5 trillion. Exempt overtime income, about $2 trillion. Exempt Social Security benefits, $1.3 trillion. That's going to add to the federal debt, another $1 trillion. Then you got a couple other little things like exempt tip income from taxes, $300 billion, first-time home buyer credit, $150, corporate tax rate for domestic manufacturing, $200 million, and secure the border and deport. I really didn't know what that meant. It was. I don't know. I do.
This is immigration policies.
Immigration policies. But anyway, if you add all of this up, that's $11.2 trillion. Okay. Now that's the amount of money potentially Trump could ask for. Okay? And we don't actually believe, I'm not predicting that's going to happen. That's just a point of reference. Now, what could he use to offset that? Oops, button. There we go. Well, the big thing you hear about is tariffs. Now, tariffs are really hard to estimate because you don't know the behavioral response by the exporting countries, both the exporters, the companies themselves, and the retaliatory tariffs that might take place from the exporting countries. And also, if I remember correctly, last time we had big tariffs, we sort of the Chinese put tariffs on on the soybeans. And so we had to compensate the farmers. So we really didn't even raise any money. So it's a big number that we're expecting to offer that could offset the cost of all of the Trump wish fors. But that number is very squishy, did you say? Or
Yeah,
rock solid.
very squishy.
And then the one that most of our clients and readers really care about are the offsetting energy credits. And until you look at the numbers, you go, oh, sounds good, energy credits. But it's not that much. 700 billion, 800 billion. And I would contend, based on my research in Tax Notes magazine, that there are a lot of Republicans who really like these IRA credits. According to one study, 80% of the IRA credits end up in Republican districts. And according to the latest count, the Republicans are going to be lucky if they have a 5-seat majority in the House. So if 5 members from these southern districts say, hey, we can't have the elimination of these IRA credits, this number could be in jeopardy. And I'm going to skip over the other stuff because mainly I really don't know what it is. But let's go back to the arithmetic. Again, the big thing you're waiting to hear about is what the budget committees, both the House and the Senate, are going to say the number is to the size of the net tax cuts.
Thanks, Marty. That was fantastic. Modusha, I'm going to turn to you. We're going to expect to see some offsets here. Can you talk to us a little bit about what we can expect to see in offsets, and how does Congress find, quote unquote, revenue raisers?
So, as we saw, there are revenue raisers that get mentioned during the campaign. Most politicians don't like to campaign on raising one's taxes. Just makes sense. And revenue raisers are hard to come by. So, and there have been decades of politicians and staffers on the Hill writing revenue raisers, and those revenue raisers getting rejected. As part of the process, the revenue raisers that enter the public sphere and ones that don't get scored by the Joint Committee on Taxation, and those go exist in the ether, or in binders, or in Congress.gov. And as this Congress or the next Congress looks for revenue raisers, they will look at existing proposals that are in the ether. Republicans will go look at Democratic proposals, not just former Republican proposals, and pull ideas, a menu perhaps, of things that might be acceptable for the next Congress. And because of the numbers Marty just walked us through, they will be looking for lots and lots of options to put on the menu. Every single menu option will get enacted, of course, but I would really, really advise taxpayers and tax advisors to go study pre-existing proposals, especially ones that have a score, especially ones that have been living in the ether long enough to come to be thought of as acceptable or in middle of the road, and just study them and think about how they impact their facts, and what changes could be made to those existing proposals if they go forth and enter the debate. I think one other thing to note is that if there's a revenue raiser that's suggested, or a revenue or a spender that's suggested, it doesn't have to get enacted in its exact form. It can be tweaked. For example, in the Inflation Reduction Act energy credits, there are ways to not raise 700 trillion from it, 700 billion from it, but to raise 300 or 500 billion from it by making changes, changing the effective dates, looking at transferability. They're all things that members of Congress and their staff will look at as we go into next year, which will be interesting to say the least.
Fantastic. Thank you. Caroline, I'm going to turn to you. We had a Republican sweep. It's unlikely that we're going to see an increase in the corporate tax rate. But is this a place where you think congressional Republicans will soften at all? Could we see any amount of, or could we see the court reused in any way to offset?
Sure. So I think that's a great question. Look, I think right now if you raise tax rates, if you raise the corporate rate, the results, the policy results are kind of counter to what Republicans have talked about wanting. So I'll quickly go through 3 examples. So for instance, in TCJA, we saw the major driver of growth was that rate reduction. So if you raise the rate, you drive down growth. That's certainly not something GOP campaigned on. I think second, you can just look at the incidence of the corporate rate that is in some part borne by labor. So you increase that rate, you decrease the wages of American workers. That's also not a GOP campaign goal. And then I would say finally, you know, right now the global norm. So right now the combined corporate rate in the US is about 25.7. The OECD average is about 23.6. So raise the rate, we become less competitive, including against countries like China. So I think that raising the rate, sort of what the results are completely counter to what Republicans want. So I think at the end of the day, I hope, and I think it should stay off the table.
So, Chris, I want to turn to you, and we haven't yet. We're faced with this sort of a problem. Maybe it's good, maybe it's bad, that we have to address the TCJA in the coming year. But we also need to start addressing the budget and the deficits that we have. Is now the time that we can actually use this moment to get back to some level of fiscal responsibility?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at reconciliation has only been around for about 50 years now. The Budget Act of 1974 put it in place. And for the first half of its life, we used reconciliation exclusively for the purpose of reducing deficits. That is actually what it's meant for. You put out a budget and then you put out how much you want to reduce deficits, and that's how you use reconciliation. Um, we haven't done that in the last few times that we've used it. And in fact, reconciliation is mostly used to massively increase deficits. We're just in a totally different place now than we were even in 2017. I was looking at the numbers today. We had about a $650 billion deficit in 2017. Today, that's about $2 trillion. As a share of the economy, it was about 3.5% of GDP. We're closer to 7% of GDP now. It is absolutely insane that we're talking about just exploding that even further, right? So is this bill the right bill to start talking about how to reduce deficits? I certainly think so. And there's an easy way you do that. You make that number negative. You say that anything that comes out of this reconciliation package has to be reducing deficits. And you don't just have to do that with revenue either. You can use spending cuts in reconciliation. And in fact, Congress usually did use spending cuts and revenue raisers to try to get our fiscal house in order.
So, Chris and Marty, and then the rest of the panel as well. Can we grow our way out of this?
I mean, the short answer is no. There are just so few tax cuts, first of all, that pay for themselves. Tax cuts just don't pay for themselves. We're not on the other side of the Laffer curve where we could be cutting tax rates and suddenly we'll be getting so much growth. You can use some of the revenue to offset the tax cuts that you want to do, right? Back in 2017, they said that $1.5 trillion was the revenue that they were hoping they'd get from raising the economic growth rate. It really turned out to be maybe like $400 billion, and the tax cuts actually ended up being about $2 trillion. So you only offset maybe a quarter of it. You can offset some of it, but we can't grow way out of the situation, right? Over the next decade, we're going to grow at about less than 2% real GDP annually for the next decade. You'd have to do about 3.5%, closer to 4% in order to grow our way out of this situation. So it's just unrealistic.
And it's very difficult to get back to those historical growth rates because of the population slowdown, not to mention the potential forced immigration of illegal aliens. In the last go around of the TCJA, the Joint Committee scored a 30% offset from economic growth. This time around, the Tax Foundation, which is not known for its low estimates of dynamic effects, is estimating a 16% offset. So pick your number. It's probably not going to, there will be some partial relief from economic growth incorporated into the score for budget reconciliation, but it is not going to pay for itself. I have to say, I don't mean to be partisan, but Senator Crapo has this idea of, well, if it's a growth provision, then it doesn't have to be scored, without mentioning what the growth provision is or how much the offset was. But he's taking this rosy view or easy path view toward passing the next round of the TCJA.
So, Carolyn, I'm going to come to you kind of for the same question because you may have a different take on it. And then also to ask you, Trump made a lot of campaign promises, and a lot of them were towards individual income taxpayers, which I think we're going to see a desire to have go through. And I wanted to get your take on those as well.
Sure. So, I mean, I would tend to agree that you can't grow your way out of this, but I would also add that you can't tax your way out of this. We have to have a conversation about spending in this country. I think if you look at the current CBO baseline, you see that about 71 trillion of non-interest spending is over the next 10 years, and 36 trillion of that is attributable to Social Security and Medicare. So, I mean, I would say, Houston, I think we found the problem. I mean, so I think we have to address spending as well. And then on the Trump proposals, look, there's a lot. Marty had a really good slide with all the numbers on them, thanks to our friends at CFRB. We talked about no tax on overtime. That's $2 trillion. No tax on tips. That's $300 billion over 10. These are 10-year scores. That's a lot of money. And so I think when you look at those, perhaps we'll see those narrowed a little bit, whether they're limited to a specific industry or the duration of the incentive is limited. So I do think, tweaks around the edges to make the numbers better. I think some of the other proposals, there's a proposal to not tax Social Security. I'm not a reconciliation expert like these folks down there, but I'm pretty sure you do Social Security changes in reconciliation. I think the last one we've heard about, the double taxation, ending double taxation of of Americans abroad. And I think that's probably the most nebulous. I mean, is that a territorial system for Americans? Is that a change to the foreign income exclusion? Is it change to housing? So I think, all these are feasible. I do think if you do a bill, some aspects of the Trump campaign promises will be included.
Yeah, I'd agree. Manisha, let's turn to the TCJA. What do you expect to see with respect to an extension of the TCJA? Do you expect a wholesale straight? Do we expect two bills? Do we expect rate increases? What are you seeing?
Well, there are many possibilities on the table. I think the individual provisions of the TCJA are the ones that are at the forefront and are most important for next Congress to pass. That said, I don't see the individual provisions of the TCJA being passed as they were passed last time in their entirety for 8 years, which is what happened last time. I think there are many possibilities in which certain provisions will be tweaked in order to make, for example, them cost less. I also think it's entirely possible to make the budget reconciliation never work that we see a shorter term extension. There are a host of numbers floating around the city right now, 3 years, 5 years. One can look at the political math as to whether you want the TCJA 2.0 provisions to expire right before a presidential election. I would guess not, but then you have to find money elsewhere. It goes back to how hard it is to find revenue raisers. So this is going to be a complicated calculus. I will point out that the most important thing, once you set the number, is making the table work, and that's no easy task. It's not just about tax policy, and it's not about evaluating the proposal versus current law. It's about, to do what you want to do, what do you have to do that's least offensive in terms of a revenue raiser? And that is going to be a huge task for the next Congress. And because there is a desire to pass a bill quickly, which might be optimistic or very optimistic, there will be...
They always say that.
They always say that, and it never happens. It's like, we just around 100 days to, give us a goal to fail against. But, it's a desire. So, trying to grab stuff and put together language in a bill quickly will happen. So they will be so they're focused on the revenue tables and finding ways to scale down the numbers with respect to the raisers, and raise the numbers with respect with respect to the spenders, and raise the numbers with respect to the raisers will be one of the things next Congress spends a lot of time doing.
Marty, same question for you. What do you expect in terms of the TCJA extension? And is it feasible to think that we're going to get a real comprehensive?
Okay, here's where you got to know your reconciliation rules, and which you hinted at, which is one of the rules is it can't cost more than that number they set in the budget reconciliation instructions. So let's say you have $8 trillion of tax cuts that you want to do, but the budget reconciliation number only says you can have 4. So how many different ways can you slice them? You can slice every proposal in half over a 10-year period, but we all know lobbyists prefer slicing it over time and saying, okay, we'll just have another extension 4 years from now. So that is one very simple and doable way of meeting the reconciliation instructions. But you need to know a few other little tidbits about reconciliation that can cause you heartburn. The easy one is you can't have stuff that's not germane to the budget. So you can't, for example, mandate an increase in the minimum wage or something like that. So that's you can't do that. But the other one is you cannot touch Social Security. Done. You can't touch Social Security. So when we say we're not going to tax Social Security benefits, can't do that in reconciliation because that directly affects Social Security. And I have a question. I have a question for Chris. If I stop taxing tips, I have to keep taxing Social Security on tips because that would affect Social Security. If I stop taxing overtime, I can only not tax overtime on income tax, but not Social Security tax, because that would affect Social Security. If I stopped, there's another one too, I can't think of it, but most people in the United States, probably not most people in this room, pay more in Social Security taxes than they do in income taxes. And so a lot of the Trump, I wanted to say Bush, I don't know where that came from. I want to say where the Trump revenue tax cuts are coming from cannot be part of any reconciliation bill. And while we're on the topic, to be part of a reconciliation bill, you have to be part of legislation. And if Trump does all of his tariff increasing unilaterally with his current congressional authority, that's not legislation. That's not active legislation that's being enacted. So that whole $2,700 that was up there, unless they enact it as part of legislation, gone, cannot be part of reconciliation.
But I think there's an important point. Even if it's that number or some numbers are not part of an official table, there's a moral argument that I suspect some will make that you should count the executive action when thinking about the effects holistically. We saw in the Inflation Reduction Act that the increased IRS funding wasn't scored by the Joint Committee on Taxation. It instead was scored by CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, and there was basically an asterisk put on the table to say that it wasn't as bad as it looked.
It also it wasn't part of the official score, really, either. Like, that's the thing, is budget reconciliation has so many weird rules. Like, I have no doubt that, especially when you look at these Trump campaign proposals, it's going to be really hard to try to fit them into the reconciliation lens. I think that, there's, $7 trillion of proposals out there. Maybe a little over half of them could actually fit into reconciliation. It's a great point that you can't really directly touch payroll taxation of different things. But what you can do is actually make changes that will indirectly affect Social Security. So there's going to be a lot of arguments with that Senate parliamentarian about what is an indirect or what is a direct touching of Social Security. Like, these are going to be huge things that play out over the next few months.
And, immigration, which is not really part of our discussion, but if you deport 10 million people, the estimate I saw was 6 million pay taxes. That's going to hurt the whole Social Security Trust Fund. So just
right, whether that's direct or not,
that's not part of reconciliation, right? And then, but the other thing I just want to mention is we've been talking like the CBO and the JCT are going to keep score on all this. That's traditional. I think we're living in non-traditional times. The law says the chairman of the budget committee can make up any numbers he wants, both on the estimates and on the baseline. So if they want to say, hey, the budget reconciliation number is $20 trillion, the only thing that's stopping them from doing that is shame. There's no legal thing to prevent the chairman of the budget committees from setting that number as high as they want.
And I think talking about baselines is important. Assuming we don't reset the rules, the budget baseline gets reset in April or March of every year, and there will be pressure to get scores that reflect the pre-change in baseline numbers, because I expect that things will get much more expensive once the budget gets reset. So that is another factor on the table in terms of the timeline. The only factor that speaks to doing something quickly, in my view.
I mean, it's in all likelihood that we're going to be using a very old baseline to score this bill, because it's going to be using the fiscal year 2025 budget resolution, which is 3 months in at that point, right? Which this didn't used to be a thing we did until 2017, when we decided to start using budgets halfway through the fiscal year. But it will very likely be scored against an old baseline, and in fact might be a baseline that doesn't even have 2035 in it, right? So all the figures that CRP put together, they're all from 2026 to 2035, because that is the traditional 10-year budget window. But on a budget resolution for fiscal year 2025, you use 25 to 34. That cuts off a whole year, and it might make things a lot cheaper, because in 2025 it doesn't cost anything to extend the tax cuts, because you don't have anything to extend.
The other thing to note is that there could be 2 budget resolutions and 2 reconciliation bills, and this gets back to Tara's question that I forgot to answer. In every Congress, there are 2 sessions, and you can have a budget resolution for each session. So there's a possibility of 2 reconciliation bills in the 119th Congress. That said, it is very possible that people start talking about 2 reconciliation bills, and we've heard that, and only one passes. Members will be promised things in the second reconciliation bills, as will stakeholders, and I would much rather have my provision in the first one than the second, to say the least.
You think that's good lobbying to get in the first one? I just want to show a quick picture of what the current policy versus current law baseline means. On the left-hand side, this is a replay of that chart I showed you before. Current law baseline budget, federal debt is $53.7 trillion. And the additional Trump policies would be 7.8. Now, when Senator Crapo, who is chairman of the Finance Committee, not a small player, he says he wants a current policy baseline. Well, all he's doing is shifting about 5 million of the trillion of this money over to here. Okay, and then he can say, look, we only spent 2.8 trillion. That's all he has to put in the reconciliation instructions. But what is the net result? It's exactly the same amount in the end of debt. So it is what I would call a gimmick. And I could give you other logical reasons why it doesn't work. But the point is, the end result is the same, but he gets to say, instead of 7.8, we're only spending 2.8.
So one of the revenue raisers in TCJA was the salt cap. No one seems to really like the salt cap, but it was a revenue raiser. What does the panel think is going to happen with the salt cap?
So, look, I think the salt cap remains in some form. I think the question is, does that $10,000 cap go up in some way? But I don't think we're just going to let it disappear. I would also note that I think Marty highlighted this. The margins in the House are razor thin. And so you do have members, Republican members from high tax states like in New York or New Jersey, et cetera, who are going to be very insistent about salt relief because their constituents are very concerned about it. So the narrower the margins, the bigger opportunity there is for one member to be king or queen for the day on an issue. And so I have to believe that maybe the SALT cap doesn't continue in its current form, but it continues in some form, in some form of compromise.
In in 2017, I think the Republicans had a 30-seat margin in the House. This time it's between, check your
Funny or
it's between 1 and 10 possibilities.
Yeah, I think
so let's just say 5 for, and then so only takes 5 New York and California Republicans go, you better start dealing here.
absolutely.
And of course, the president himself, President-elect himself, did say, I want to get rid of the whole thing,
And the more you touch that number, the more more expensive this gets, right? I think Marty pointed out that it was $1 trillion to get rid of the SALT cap. You can actually make the SALT cap raise more money. There's a bunch of workarounds that a lot of blue states have figured out to help wealthy people kind of get more, SALT relief. You could limit those. In fact, the Treasury Department did try to do that in the first Trump administration. So that's a revenue raiser. But, it's more likely that we're going to be loosening the cap at some point. The do no harm principle would say that you should just extend it in full. But yeah, it seems very unlikely that's going to happen.
And I think it's possible that you see the SALT cap getting tightened in some and getting looser in others in legislation. I do think it's very possible that the numerical limit goes up. It's currently can. It could go to 15. It could go to 20. You could create different rules based for married filing jointly versus single taxpayers, which would be in line with Republican policy. You could also see things like the pass-through entity workaround addressed, which was put out during Trump's first term by the Treasury Department, or blessed in some form. So you can see lots of different ways that you could play with the SALT cap, and there are ways to make that specific policy maybe revenue neutral, depending on playing with the numbers and up.
Well, let me turn to our in-person audience and just remind you guys, please feel free to ask questions at any time. We're happy to incorporate this into the conversation. But turning back to some of the individual provisions in the TCJA, Carolyn, what do we think about 199 Cap A?
I think that, so obviously it's one of the individual provisions that's sunsetting. I think that given the very populist sort of slant of the Republican Party, particularly in the House right now, as well as Speaker Johnson's current support for 199 Cap A permanency, I do think that's probably at the top of the priority list to make permanent and to provide certainty. And that would parallel the fact that the corporate rate is also permanent.
I think 2 ways it could be changed, and it's either way, either more generous or less generous. More generous would be to not limit it or not deny it to professionals like lawyers and accountants, which I think is just terrible. No, but it is an arbitrary line. Athletes, who else?
Actresses,
Accountants, are excluded,
Okay.
but not engineers for some reason. The other way to contract it and still keep it generally popular is to put a dollar limit on it, because we do know that there are some very large S corporations and partnerships that make a lot of money.
Yeah, and I think we have some guardrails already built in. We have the limitation on 50% of W-2 wages, or a limitation based on investment. And I think Treasury studies have shown that kicks out about 40% of the 199 Cap A beneficiary, or, is a dollar amount. So, I think I'll take the view that we have good guardrails in place.
But I think the Treasury data or the Joint Committee data, one of them, show that most of the benefits go to higher income folks.
Well, I think, look, 50% of the
They're very millionaires.
50% of business income goes through the pass-through side of the code. So not addressing 199 Cap A is equivalent to putting sunblock on half your face. I mean, it's not really an option not to address pass-through.
No, and it's not going anywhere. 25 million tax returns have claimed it, so it's there.
Freddie, we agree on something at 199A.
So in the unlikely event that this happens, let's still talk about it. What happens if we don't get a bill? We can't get something through by December 31st, 2025. What happens if the TCJA expires?
Well, the accountants go nuts because they have to fill out their 10Ks as though it's never going to appear. That's one thing. But besides that, it's certainly possible. Remember, the goal in 2017 was to finish by January 1st, and it wasn't done until December 22nd, and they were rushing like crazy. They didn't have a proper set of hearings, in my opinion. So it certainly could go over time, which would be okay because they could always retroactively extend the provide the benefits, but the accountants will not be happy at all.
But Congress loves going down to the wire or going past the wire. It's part of, Christmas fun every year in the city.
I mean, the good news is that we wouldn't be exploding the federal deficit. Like that's the good news. It's
aligning.
Current law projections say that
Chris is happy. Everybody else is happy.
no, it would definitely make me happy, but it would make the tax code a lot more complicated, right? I mean, there were some really good aspects of the TCJA that made it so there's a lot less filers than there used to be before. There's so many different, like, people really like the expansion of the child tax credit and stuff like that. Like, it's probably, if past this prologue, you look at what happened when the Bush tax cuts were about to expire, there was a temporary extension. I would imagine that there would be a temporary extension that could get bipartisan votes in both chambers if that were the case. But you wouldn't be going through reconciliation at that point.
I think the big wild card here is Republican unity. If Republicans are unified, no problem. We can get this done January 21st. But and Mr. Trump is very different than any other president we've ever had. So maybe the discipline he can impose upon his fellow Republicans can expedite this process. But as Carolyn,
No, I'm going to agree with you.
as Carolyn says, the kings and queens may not feel that way. That is, the 6 or 7 opponents have solved. The 8 or 9 opponents of the repeal of green energy credits might go, there's no way I can vote for this.
I mean, I think, look, the reality is you have a trifecta. You have single party control. You have a president who's campaigned on tax promises, whether it's extension of TCJA or the things we've discussed here. So you have an executive office buy-in. I mean, to me, the stars are aligned. If Republicans can't do something now, I mean, I don't know when we can do when something can be.
You also have to think about the bottom line on American individuals. If TCJA doesn't get extended on the individual side, take-home paychecks go down by, I think, around 5% next year and 11% the following year if you don't extend the individual provisions in TCJA, and that is motivation for members of Congress, if anything is.
Yeah,
no, I would agree with that.
It's good motivation.
Don't take away my votes. So we got a question in on 163J. The question is, what do you think will happen to 163J, as I don't believe it's on the list of provisions that will sunset? So it will be modified. So will it be modified to allow more interest expense deductions?
So we've already seen the change go from EBITDA to EBIT. So I think 163J is one of the sort of 3 horsemen who are included in the Smith-Wyden bill, the other being bonus, and then R&D expensing. So I do think it'll be addressed. I do think the loss of the DA, the loss of the ability to, bring depreciation and amortization into that calculation is particularly damaging for long-term investments. So I think I'm hopeful, and I know a lot of the business community or clients are hopeful that, not just 163J, but all those items get addressed.
I think 163 is a small change compared to the other stuff we're talking about. But if increased interest deductions are painted as a gift to private equity and all this anti-Wall Street stuff starts percolating up, it might have a few twists and turns along the way.
And the more stuff that you keep adding to the bill, the more expensive it gets. Like, the most people are talking about 3.9 trillion. That's just extending everything from that expires in 2025. That doesn't even include 100% bonus. That doesn't include those changes to net interest deductibility. Like, if you start adding those things, that's another nearly $1 trillion, and so 4.8 trillion. And that's without adding anything new. That's not without tax on tips. That's without exempting overtime. So it's getting even more expensive as we're talking.
Remember priorities to get the Queen and King's votes for the day, which I will also add up once you add a few of them in. I also think it's important to note that because of post TCJA changes to the code. For example, the corporate alternative minimum tax 163J isn't as helpful to certain taxpayers as it was before, and I think there'll be a couple odd dynamics playing out as we, add complexity on top of complexity and see who the likely winners and losers may be based on guessing.
And just because we haven't made it complicated enough, the chairman, Jason Smith, said of the Ways and Means Committee, said not just TCJA provisions are on the table, everything is on the table. And I know some folks are advocating for tighter passive partnership rules, for example, that do need tightening, and they would there are a lot of loopholes out there that could use some tightening. So they might get more. So folks who maybe think they're off the radar now might be drawn back in the radar as these numbers get very tight.
And they should do this. They should do fundamental tax reform. That would be great. I mean, if it's going to take longer than 100 days, but let's talk about how we make our tax code more efficient. Actually, let's just do everything except the rate cuts, and then we're probably good, right? And that's most of the cost.
I like fundamental tax reform in 100 days. That would be.
Was supposed to sleep?
No. Manisha, you mentioned the CAMT. What do you think will happen to CAMT in the coming year?
So I've gotten a lot of questions in my practice about the possible repeal of the corporate alternative minimum tax. I think it is highly unlikely. It is repealing it would cost money, and it is not anybody's priority to repeal CAMT. It's not a Republican priority. Jason Smith and his membership like small business, not big business. The talking point here isn't small business at all.
Yes.
And given the fact that the corporate alternative minimum tax, many of those impacted acts as a compliance nuisance, but doesn't always or often actually result in cash tax or a permanent item, it's going to be something that most companies aren't going to spend lobbying clout on. So I think the corporate minimum tax is around to stay. Could be wrong. My crystal ball is usually wrong, but I think it's around to stay.
I think everybody in the tax community loathes the corporate alternative minimum tax.
As the person who made an analogy to a board game, I do too.
But I think if you're talking to the public, we're going to tax large corporations that aren't paying their fair share. It's hard. If you have to look among all the possibilities, it's an easy target.
The talking points are good, the details are not good, and that makes it really hard to repeal.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I would say if it were not in a year that we had to address TCJ and all these other items, I would like to think that there is space to reform CAMT or do something with it to maybe make it Pillar 2 compliant. Maybe there's something there, but this is not going to be the year in which that happens.
Yeah.
It seems unlikely to me.
Yeah, I would agree. On the international front, let's just talk about that briefly. What do we think is going to happen in the coming administration in terms of international tax? Obviously, there's rate increases that could come on Guilty and Beat and Fitty as part of TCJ, but maybe more importantly, Pillar 2. What do we think might happen there? Marty, I'll just turn to you since you're looking at me, and I know you have an answer.
I don't have a good answer is the problem. I think that Chairman Jason Smith and the President will make good on their threats to, if anybody starts taxing us, we're going to start taxing them, which will put a big damper on Pillar 2. I don't think we're going to enact a Pillar 2. So, but there's already in place in many countries around the world, Pillar 2 taxes are in place. So it's something that companies are going to have to deal with. The only dynamic that could possibly come to fruition, if the business community is willing to ruffle the president's feathers, is to say, hey, we don't like paying these taxes in these third world and in Europe, third world. In Europe and in East Asian countries, and we need to do our own. But that's a long way off.
Yeah, but one also can One can query whether the business community is going to use clout to say, we'd rather write you the check than somebody else the check. It seems not very likely to.
Look, I think the House GOP has been pretty clear about where they are on this. So you have Jason Smith and all members of the GOP Ways and Means Committee introducing a bill that allows for retaliatory measures against countries that are construed as doing discriminatory taxes on the U.S. You have Mr. Hearn, who's a member of Ways and Means, writing a letter to the current Secretary of the Treasury, reminding her that the Congress is responsible for changes to who pays the U.S. fisc, not the administration. And then, I mean, I think you can just, sort of look generally at some of the other things that have been floated. The U.S. provides a tremendous amount of funding for the OECD. I think there are questions about why are we funding this thing that is now completely sort of, harming U.S. companies, but also harming the U.S. fisc potentially. So, I mean, I think that the GOP has been pretty clear that they're not interested in pursuing, P2 the way this administration has been.
And I think one thing you're going to give President Trump really credit for from his first administration, he's not afraid to negotiate. Like, this man would absolutely bring people back to the negotiating table. Who knows who the Treasury Secretary rumor is today. But, I imagine that person will be a big part of this conversation.
But if he negotiates these tariffs away, by the way, you lose that revenue. So
it also goes into the point of how dynamic the conventional scores are as we move forth next year.
So we've gotten a couple of questions. I wasn't necessarily going to ask these, but we've gotten a couple of questions on IRS funding and whether we see the funding that was given to the IRS under the IRA being clawed back in this administration.
Well, they've already clawed back quite a bit of it. The CBO has scored the effects of clawing back more of the IRA fund or of the IRS funding, and we're now going to lose $3 for every dollar that we spend on the IRS. It's good. Tax gap measures used to be a bipartisan thing, by the way. It wasn't until recently when it was not bipartisan. President Trump included a lot of tax gap measures in his budgets. I would hope that there would be a recognition that going after tax cheats and making sure people pay their fair share would come back and be in vogue again. A lot of the money that's been currently spent is for mostly customer service. We should probably be spending more of it on enforcement, and we'll be able to get back that money. But honestly, we shouldn't be repealing any more of that money. That will definitely be part of the appropriations fights over the next few years. If it's part of a weird thing about scoring is that if it's part of reconciliation, it actually does count against the score now, is where you couldn't use. If you fund the IRS, you actually can't use that as a part of the official score in reconciliation of the revenue you're going to get. But the opposite is not true. It's if you do defund the IRS and you lose revenue, that score counts against you for reconciliation. So I doubt it'll be repealed in the upcoming reconciliation fight.
Yeah.
Okay, terrific. So we're going to finish off. We've got one last audience question, unless there's any in the room, since we haven't taken any. Rachel, could you walk over with the mic?
Sure. David Jimenez, the Scannon Center, doing a lot of work on family policies. So what options do you think might be on the table for extending and expanding the child tax credit?
Are you looking at me, Marty Sullivan?
At the very least, they'll continue the current extensions, right?
I think this notion that the GOP doesn't like the child tax credit is false. I mean, the GOP really started and created the child tax credit. Jason Smith has the sort of 24th poorest district in the country and the 6th most conservative. I mean, he is very interested. He's made it very clear that this bill needs to be about families and workers. We have a 21% rate because in TCJA, Senators Lee and Rubio wanted a larger child tax credit. So, this notion that Republicans dislike or don't, support the policy is sort of a misconception. I mean, I think realistically we will. Will it be as big as it was, under the rescue plan? No. But I do think it's a priority, and it's particularly a priority in a House that's very driven by populist sentiment right now.
It wouldn't shock me if White and Smith was included in whatever the reconciliation package that they're working on, the changes that I believe it was indexing it for inflation after 2025 and increasing the refundability. But the thing about the child tax credit is it's very expensive. It goes to so many people that any kind of increase, actually go to crfp.org, build your own child tax credit. We have a tool for it, and you can kind of see how expensive it is. And it's like, if you did the ARP style one, that's $1.3 trillion. That's a lot of money.
Fantastic. Well, we are just about out of time. We have one more question.
My name is Ed Weiler, and I run a small gig business to help individual taxpayers. But so some months back, well, maybe 2 months back, Bond Buyer, which is a trade rag for the municipal bond industry, raised that old favorite and saying, "Oh, there's talk on the Hill once again to lift the tax exemption on the muni bonds." Is there any substance to that? I've not been able to surface anything other than that article.
I've heard just about as much as you have heard. Just it mentioned. I don't think it's on the front burner. I mean, you've already taken away the SALT deduction to the state and local governments. I don't think you want to double whammy them. And then those municipal bond dealers, they're a pretty powerful group. So I just think it's a academic idea at this point.
But I do think it's worth noting that any and every idea that anybody's ever thought of seems to be making the gossip rounds
That's
around
right.
the city right now.
Nobody's safe.
Yeah.
Everything's on the table.
Yeah, I think if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. I mean, it's pretty simple.
And those are the words that we'll end with. If you're not on the table, you're on the menu. Well, I want to thank our in-person audience as well as our virtual audience today for your time and attention. Those that are in the room, please feel free to hang out for a bit and ask questions of the panelists. We were delighted to have you. So thanks, everyone. Have a great day.